Kwekwe Unusakut Tanse, hello, bonjour. Je suis ici aujourd'hui.
I am here today with my Deputy Minister, Christian Fuchs.
To you today in Ottawa from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thank you for joining us. I want to congratulate, in particular, Chief Skeed and all members of the Anishinaabe Wajish-Onagum Nation. Each and every long-term water advisory lift is significant, and I'm grateful to have been able to celebrate this morning the most recent one, about an hour ago. Thanks to the leadership and determination of Chief Skeed and the project team on the ground, as of today, residents of Wajish-Onagum Nation now have access to clean drink, the community's last remaining drinking water advisory. This marks an important milestone, the lifting of the 100th long-term drinking water advisory in a First Nation since November of 2015. I also want to congratulate Hanikutin First Nation government in BC on lifting the last remaining long-term drinking water advisory in their community, bringing reliable access to clean water to 8 homes. This marks the 101st long-term drinking water advisory lifted since November 2015, and it was a real pleasure to speak to Chief Lua yesterday and his team on the significance of that lifting and their priorities going forward. There's more progress today than ever before. In November 2015, when we formed government, there were 105 long-term drinking water advisories on public systems on reserves across the country. There was no tracking of how many advisories existed or plans for each one to resolve it. The funding was short-term and didn't allow for long-term planning. Most importantly, there was no commitment to fix the issue. Officially, as of today, First Nations with support from our government have lifted 101 long-term water advisories since then. Notably, all long-term drinking water advisories were lifted in the Atlantic, Alberta, and Quebec. During the same time, of importance, 175 short-term advisories have also been lifted. Major milestones like these are only possible because of the result of countless smaller actions that have been undertaken day after day, community by community. They are the result of tireless work by water operators and by project teams in communities, by the dedication of chiefs and council, and by officials at Indigenous Services Canada who have pursued this goal relentlessly. The cumulative effect of these actions in First Nations communities across the country is that today substantial progress has been achieved. Today, 98 new water plants and 418 upgrades have been funded, which translates to over 460,000 people, 5,800 homes, and 430 community buildings, including schools and health centers that will all have clean drinking water, which simply hasn't been the case 5 years ago. This reflects more than $3.5 billion in investments over the last 5 years.
I would like to congratulate all of the members of the Anishinaabe Nation and the nation in BC. Both communities raised their last long-term drinking water advisories, representing the 101st advisories raised since 2015. These are long-term advisories are more complicated than any of us want them to be, something I've heard directly from community members and which I've experienced only a small part of during my time as minister. Yet we remain as committed as ever to ensuring that every First Nation community has access to clean drinking water. Our commitment to lift all long-term drinking water advisories on public systems on reserve remain firm. We will continue working in partnership with First Nations to ensure every single one is lifted and remains so. Since 2016, the government has invested over $3.5 billion toward drinking water and wastewater improvements, historic investments in First Nations communities for infrastructure. With these investments, communities have made significant progress. And yes, there is still work ahead of us, but we have a plan. For each of the remaining 58 long-term advisories affecting 38 communities, projects are in place and work is currently underway to address each one in a timely and sustainable way that aligns with the community's priorities.
That are popping up. Of all long-term drinking water advisories that have been in place since 2015, 63.5% have been lifted. An additional 20% have projects that will help lift drinking water advisories under construction, and 10.7% have lifts recommendations in place, which means that projects are complete and that communities are in the very last stages before actually lifting the water advisory, which is their decision. To keep track of our progress in a truly open and transparent way, we've just launched a new webpage that will be the hub for community-focused water information. The new homepage is visible on the screen next to me. The new website demonstrates the progress communities have made since 2015. The investments provided outline the work that still needs to be done to achieve clean drinking water. It breaks down all remaining work, community by community, and will be continuously updated to reflect the most current information. I believe Canadians need to see what I'm seeing. The information here goes beyond long-term tracking drinking water advisory. It also includes details on why communities face long-term drinking water advisories, the process involved in lifting an advisory, the status of each project, and the work required to keep water systems running and staffed. It is a one-stop shop for all information on our progress in achieving our commitment to lift all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations on reserve. Each of the 38 remaining communities with a long-term water advisory will have a page as shown on the screen right now. On this page, anyone will be able to see the projected lift date, a tracker on the status of the projects, and a history on the work undertaken to date. I will also be following up personally with communities to give them written confirmation of the progress to date and our commitment to them in lifting the long-term water advisory. There will also be a regularly updated map to be able to see at a glance where the remaining long-term water advisories are located. Lastly, I want to bring your attention to this page, highlighting the steps to lifting long-term drinking water advisories. The process to lift a water advisory is a simple, straightforward process. It can be complex, requiring multiple steps at multiple stages. While each water advisory is unique, this page provides a comprehensive overview of the work being done by First Nations, Indigenous Services Canada, and partners to provide clean drinking water to communities. Nous sommes reconnaissants d'avoir eu l'occasion.
We're grateful to have had the opportunity to work with an Indigenous-owned business to develop the webpage. And we'll be continuously updating the page with the latest information as we move forward. This past year presented new challenges many of us never expected to face. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the health and well-being of First Nation community members has been our top priority, and Canada's top priority. First Nations have been exceptional in leading the response to protect their communities from the virus. This pandemic has affected nearly every facet of our lives over the past year, and this is very much the case when it comes to infrastructure work. While some communities have been able to proceed with their work with minimal interruption, others have had to stop work completely. We are working in true partnership with communities, which means fully respecting their priorities. All government, while we continue our collective efforts to address the ongoing pandemic together, the Government of Canada and First Nations also remain focused on building long-term solutions to support sustainable access to safe, clean drinking water and restore trust in the water supply.
The work doesn't stop once advisories are lifted. We're also making investments in expanding water infrastructure and operations, in maintenance and training programs to ensure we never find ourselves in this situation again. To that end, the fall economic statement committed $1.5 billion in new funding to accelerate the work on our commitment to clean drinking water in First Nations communities, and $114 million per year ongoing to increase support for daily operations and maintenance of water and wastewater infrastructure on reserves. We've heard from First Nations leadership that operations and maintenance is essential to efficiently managing their water infrastructure, the critical asset in a community. To support communities in doing so, we'll be providing $616 million over 6 years and $114 million per year ongoing thereafter for operations and maintenance costs, ensuring longer life cycles and more durable systems, enabling First Nations to better maintain their water and wastewater infrastructure over the long term. Ongoing operations and maintenance support is critical to ensuring the longevity of this commitment. And we know that unexpected events happen, but we also know that we can plan to minimize the risks to water systems to support the upkeep and the maintenance of infrastructure that's been overlooked for far too long, all with the goal of supporting access to reliable, clean, safe drinking water in all First Nations communities. The department's also supporting a First Nations-led engagement process for the review of safe drinking water legislation. This work will enable a co-developed legislative framework to address the concerns of the existing Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, and would enable the development of a regulatory regime that supports First Nations to ensure safe drinking water access on reserve. We're also continuing work with First Nations to co-develop a long-term water and wastewater strategy to ensure ongoing sustainability of water and wastewater on reserves. Our government's making progress to fix these historical wrongs, and Canadians know just how important this is. We remain committed and continue to stand with First Nations partners to lift all long-term drinking boil water advisories and ensure access to clean and safe drinking water for generations to come. J'aimerais maintenant aussi.
I would also now like to provide you with a COVID-19 update. In the past few weeks, Canada has authorized 2 new COVID-19 vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. This means that Canada now has 4 safe and effective vaccines approved by health experts in Canada. And it will help us vaccinate more people more quickly.
Vaccine misinformation has been circulating to some communities. I urge everyone to please be careful. Look for and share information only from trusted sources. This includes provincial and territorial health authorities, community health centers, nursing stations, and local healthcare providers. We're diligently working to identify and address all unsolicited and suspicious offers of COVID-19 vaccines for sale that have been made available to any First Nation, Inuit, and Métis community. Canada has procured safe, effective, and free vaccines for everyone and will continue to ensure the authenticity and safety of any and all vaccines being provided. We'll also keep and continue to keep an eye on the variants of concern. Thankfully, only 2 cases of the B117 variant of concern have been found on reserve thus far, but we believe that there may be more that have yet to be confirmed. In Ontario, we're keeping a close eye on Thunder Bay as they moved into lockdown last week, following outbreaks at correctional facilities and schools. And among the homeless population, my department's currently working with the City of Thunder Bay, the Thunder Bay Urban Indigenous Task Force in the province of Ontario, to address the immediate needs of Indigenous peoples living in the area. We're also closely monitoring the COVID-19 outbreak in Arvia at Nunavut, which has seen a surge of cases in the past few weeks. A public health rapid response team remains in the community, and more than 2,300 COVID-19 tests have been performed to date. Nous continuons de travailler en collaboration.
We continue to work with the Canadian Armed Forces in the provinces and territories to support the vaccination campaign. Currently, the Canadian Armed Forces are on the ground in a number of First Nations communities, including the Fort Nelson community in BC and another in Ontario. They are distributing vaccines. Earlier this week, the Canadian Armed Forces were also deployed to the Cree Anuskanum community in Manitoba. As of March 8th, First Nations communities on reserve had access to 1,240, and that means over 22,000 confirmed COVID cases. Therefore, this is an increase that has not been seen since November. We are continuing to work with First Nations and provincial and territorial partners. As of March 4th, 80 communities were starting to be vaccinated. The number of doses administered was over 127,000, over 40% of the population. Our objective remains to ensure that COVID-19 vaccinations are available to everyone who wishes one. We need to continue practicing social distancing, wearing masks, and washing our hands to continue to stop the spread of COVID-19. Together, we will protect our community and return to normal life more quickly.
Marcy, thank you et merci. Nous sommes impatients maintenant de prendre vos questions.
We are eager to answer your questions.
Nous allons maintenant répondre aux questions, une question de suivi, une question et une question de suivi. Et on va commencer avec des questions par téléphone. Operator, first question, please.
Thank you. Merci. For questions, please press star 1 on your device's keypad. Pour toute question, faites étoile 1 sur votre appareil. The first question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Your line is open.
Good morning, Minister. The chief of Puckatawagan said that the moment the vaccines entered her community, people let their guard down and started holding parties. I'm wondering what kind of messaging Indigenous Services Canada is issuing to bands about following protocols, or if that responsibility is more under the provincial or the band realm.
No, and thank you, Dylan. And what may seem as a very natural human reaction is something that we're all fighting, I think, as Canadians. Our efforts have been to underscore, and whether it's in conjunction with the province or the local health authorities, which are the most trusted source, the federal government's been engaged in ensuring that people know that, yeah, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a whole heck of a lot of tunnel left. And until everyone's vaccinated, none of us are particularly that safe. And so, not knowing, and again, the science is evolving with respect to the vaccine. We know that what it does and what's proven to do is prevent mortality, prevent severe onset of COVID-19 onto people. We don't know for sure whether that prevents spread, and so that's the big question mark. And we hope that the data will prove otherwise. But as part of that analysis, we have to make sure that the very basic things that have kept people safe, and that's something we do in conjunction with provincial health authorities and most importantly local health leadership, is to reinforce those public safety health measures. You just need to look around the world to see that those countries that in some cases have a larger penetration of the vaccine distribution, we're also dealing at the same time with massive outbreaks. And so while vaccines provide that light at the end of the tunnel, there's still a whole heck of a lot of work to go, and that is a community by community approach. And we do our absolute best, and to the extent you can get that out through your mediums, Dylan, we'd really encourage that as well, because it's a multi-pronged approach. My worry as a minister, and that's the worry of every health official, is about getting that last vaccine into the arms of people and not the first.
Thank you. And I'm wondering about the cost and the rationale for updating the website on boil water advisories. And I mean this with the greatest respect, but I can anticipate a lot of these communities would say they want more work done on fixing the issue instead of better graphics or more photos. There is an existing dashboard, so I'm just wondering if the First Nations themselves have asked for this redesign and how much money this is costing.
Well, I think Canadians, I think in particular First Nations that are under long-term water advisories, want to get as much information about what the plan is, and what's going on in their fellow communities. Today was a great moment to lift up, and I had a ceremony with Chief Skeet in Washajonagum. And if I could share that with you, it would be great. The very positive, happy to finally see after 9 years, which is an unacceptable time period, fresh water flowing through taps in their community, and it represents an incredible amount of work done, in particular by those community members. The same thing for Honeycoutine yesterday. Just the work that they're doing to make sure that their community members have clean water. Is great, and we want to continue that momentum. But they've also showed concern for other communities across Canada that have not lifted their long-term water advisories. So they too want to see what's going on in other communities. So the effort today is for Canadians to see what I see, and to give everyone as much information as possible as to the status of each community, as well as the work that's been done and the commitment of this government to get it done. We walked into 105 as a government, 105 long-term water advisories with absolutely zero plan to get them lifted. Today we've lifted 101, and there's a plan for every other community. And I think that needs to be shared with Canadians. It needs to be shared with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And you can draw your own conclusion as to the quantity and quality of that website, Dylan. And we obviously welcome your feedback, but it is an effort to get out there as much information as we have so people can see the progress that's been made.
Thanks, Dylan. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question is from APTN News. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. And first of all, congratulations to the new addition to your family. My question is just for clarity, actually. What is, besides the website, exactly what is new today? Like you mentioned 616 for O&M. What else is besides the website? What's new here? What you're announcing?
Yeah, and thanks for the congratulations, Jamie. I'm a bit young to be a grandfather, so I'm getting a little tired of the pipe and slipper comments that have been made to me by some very close friends. I'll be 48 on Friday, but it's a great day. It's a great day to have a new life in this world. So thank you. What's new today? When I spoke to you and your colleagues in late November, early December, you asked me, when are we going to get more information about communities that are still on long-term water advisories? Olivia, who's ready to ask a question, had contacted communities independently to get their views on things and produced an article about that. But I think it's important for Canadians to have all the information that we're seeing as much as in real time as we can share, obviously respecting community needs as well and their wishes. We have a plan to get those remaining water advisories lifted, and you need to see them. This is a promise that I made during that press conference in December when you said when will they all be lifted? Well, now people can look onto the website and see the detailed planning involved, and I don't underestimate the amount of work to be done, particularly in the face of a global pandemic. But we're ready to work through this. The funds that we announced in December as part of the fall economic statement were ones that were designed to ensure the capital investments through a very challenging time of COVID, which we can't underestimate the impact of, and we can't underestimate what it may still do. I say, and because I know it to be true, that we've lost, in effect, a construction season, but it isn't an excuse. The Prime Minister put me here to get it done, and that's what I plan to do. People can see that. They don't need to trust my words. They can see that on the website and see the commitment of the government to lift all of those water advisories. So this is an effort in transparency. Each community, most importantly, I will be contacting and have started to contact directly to give them further undertakings that we will be with them for the long run. Recall, as we spoke in December, that there was much concern about where the Government of Canada would be past the March 2021 deadline. And that's where the discussion about the massive investments in operation maintenance with respect to a formula that was outdated comes into play, because the money that was announced in November gives the financial backing of the Government of Canada to communities who perhaps were wondering where we were going to go in March of 2021. And our comment to them and our commitment to them is we will be there in the long run. So to sum up and to answer your question as to what is new, yes, you have a new website with more details that we needed to update after having assessed the impact of COVID on those communities, and communities, most importantly, two of which we're celebrating the lift, and that's what I would say is new, because we're celebrating those lifts, and it's very important to highlight both Honeycoteen and Waashashonagam, because 100 is a milestone. They now have clean water, and so those are the new elements that we're highlighting today.
Jamie, do you have a follow-up?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, you mentioned. I know everybody's, very pleased to hear your commitment to transparency. But concerning the March 2021 deadline, do we have a new deadline? Can you commit to a new deadline?
Again, Jamie, everyone will be able to see what's on that website. Some communities, and I've mentioned them before, in particular, Shoal Lake 40, Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, have longer-term projects. And they have chosen, and this is a choice that I respect, to maintain their long-term water advisories until such time as those long-term projects are completed. And we said we're going to be with them. So you'll be able to see that on the website. I think what Canadians are interested is in, there is a balance of them that we are hopeful about. A number of them are producing clean water, and they are in the process of assessing when to lift that long-term water advisory. An easy example of that is Wabsumung, who is ready to lift. However, as you may well note, they've gone through a pretty devastating surge of COVID in their community. So you can imagine the challenge of doing the final tests on the water system and then lifting. That is one of many examples where there is a little bit of complexity that we have to navigate. I'm hopeful with respect to the short term, and what I think Canadians should be hopeful about is there actually is a plan in the case of communities that still have those long-term water advisories in place.
Thank you, Jamie. And we'll take one more question from the phone before turning to the room. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Julie Marceau, Radio-Canada. À vous.
Julie Marceau, Radio-Canada. Good afternoon, Mr. Miller. Congratulations. I'll be a grandmother in 2 months as well. I'd like to know, on the website, is there data that was not there and that was added? And there are some First Nations that don't have access to internet. So who is this for, really? Answer. Thank you, Julie. As I said to Jamie, I'm still 47 for another 2 days, so it's a bit strange to be a grandfather, but cosmetic changes? No, we want it to look good, obviously, but that's not the reason why we asked for the addition of an Indigenous box to give us opinions on how to present not only the data available on a long-term drinking water advisories, which Canadians are interested in also, obviously, but also First Nations. And you'll see yourself that there will be more information on, one, the plan community by community for raising their long-term drinking water advisories, as well as the Government of Canada's commitment to work with these communities. So that was my commitment when we spoke at the end of November, early December, about more detailed information on each community so that I could know exactly what the information was for each community. In 2015, there was massive underinvestment in these communities by previous governments. That's the reality. 105 long-term drinking water advisories with no plan to get rid of them. We are targeting the 102nd now. We celebrated the 101st raising of the long-term drinking water advisory in partnership and in respect with First Nations. So the efforts that have been made on the website are to show Canadians and First Nations and non-Indigenous people what is the game plan for communities that are more complex, where there are more long-term commitments made. And that's what the two communities I spoke to are claiming. They were very happy to celebrate the 100th and 101st raising of long-term drinking water advisories, but they're also unhappy that there are still drinking water advisories here in a country like Canada, but now we have a game plan for these issues. Question. The question was already asked a number of times by my colleague from the Canadian Press. It's not very clear. Every time we talk about advisories, including in the Auditor General's report, we seem to talk about public networks. So we're excluding communities that have drinking water problems but are not tied to a public network. How many are there? 1,000 more? In Quebec, they're saying 0. But one community still has this issue. Are you saying that it's not your problem because it's not the public network? Answer. Well, the definition of the public network is water that serves more than 5 homes, I believe. I sank 5 wells. So the definition is clear. You're asking me a question about water in general, which is also interesting, of course. We're talking about planning and infrastructure in communities. They're talking about a nuance that they're very important, and I'm not trying to deny that. But we're also talking about today a project to raise long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations communities, which are the responsibility of the Government of Canada. We encourage each community to have a long-term infrastructure plan, and those are things that we'll work on. There are a lot of questions about private wells, which are sometimes very far from a water system or source, and that would be the responsibility of the Government of Canada, but you need to have that discussion with the community itself. Sometimes it's the responsibility of the provinces as well, but we need to talk about it, and that's a more general question tied to water. But the general infrastructure planning needs to be looked at community by community based on their infrastructure needs. Thank you. Now we'll take a question in the room.
Good afternoon, Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. Can you help me understand how launching a new website helps communities get clean water faster?
Yeah, you could take 2 approaches to it. First and foremost, Canadians rightfully have been asking the federal government to do something that, with respect to a situation that shouldn't have been the case in the first place, which is clean water in Indigenous communities. And we made that commitment, and we're going to fulfill it. So Canadians are demanding answers, and this is something you requested in November and December, and we felt that Canadians, Indigenous peoples, need to see what we're seeing and what that commitment is, because there's been some questions about that commitment. So now that website gives more detail in a user-friendly fashion where people can go community by community and say, what is the commitment of the federal government and what is happening? What is the progress for each timeline to get the water advisory lifted? There sometimes is a knee-jerk reaction to say that this is a simple thing. It is very complex at times. It's something that has to be done in respect of the community's needs and priorities, but also knowing that there can be challenges. I've named COVID many times, but there are others. You can't deny that. The reality of it is that this government has made massive investments into infrastructure, and people want to see where that's going. And they want to see that commitment, particularly Indigenous communities that are still on long-term water advisories, for the long term. There is that barrier of trust that I've spoken often about that needs to be reinforced. So that effort of openness and transparency provides First Nations the certainty not only that it is happening in their community, but that it's happening, and Anikotin and Washashonagam spoke about it, but in other communities across Canada, because they don't think it's fair either, even though theirs are getting lifted and they've worked really hard to do it. So you may say that a website alone doesn't do that, but it does start to build the confidence because people get to see what I'm seeing, what my department's seeing. They also get to see perhaps some of the challenges and pitfalls. And I think that's what we undertook as a government. They also need to see the commitment, and this is something that I will be doing in terms of speaking to community leadership with water advisory still in place. They'll get a letter that reinforces our commitment and the long-term commitment of the Government of Canada to them, because that is always an open question. and it needs to be addressed for people to have that confidence. And in terms of our work with the community, they need to know that we're relentless in getting it done. And so that's what it provides.
What, if anything, is changing with your approach to doing this work in terms of policy changes? Because the Auditor General was very critical of this, saying that your department's working with a 30-year-old policy. So I'm wondering if you can give us more specifics. And do you have a timeline for when the majority of these advisories will be lifted by?
Yeah, and look, one of the big, while it might not strictly speaking, if you were to take a very strict capital infrastructure approach to this, connected to the lifting of a water advisory, communities have told us time again, and it's reflected in the risk ratings of critical infrastructure in communities, the need to have a long-term commitment in operations and maintenance, equal pay for equal work, and the policy was outdated. It was only an 80-20 model where sometimes the communities didn't have that extra 20. Some did, but some thought it was unfair. It is unfair. It should be fully funded, and that's what our commitment and our move in the fall to get that announced and out the door, which we're moving quite quickly to get out the door, to do achieves. It's important for communities to know that we are there with them. We are committed to doing it with them, and to be doing it in partnership. If I've learned anything in the short time I've been the minister, is we need to keep that dialogue open, and we need to keep our messaging with communities clear. And it's often at times where I've been a little careful speaking publicly about communities without their permission, because it is something some communities prefer to be more public and some don't, and there are examples of that, and that's something that we need to respect as well. It's one of the subtleties that we have to compose with when actually launching the website and the detail that we put in those updates. But it's something that we know contributes to building the trust, which shows communities that we'll be with them in the long term, and we're relentless in helping them get their long-term water advisories lifted. Oh, for the majority,
to have their advisories lifted.
Again, as I said to Jamie, the numbers I'm looking at, we are pretty confident that we can get that construction season back with the additional investments to communities, and then be down really to the short strokes. So I think this is something that perhaps we should discuss in the fall to see that progress. I'd look at Wave 2, which has hit Indigenous communities in terms of numbers 50 plus times harder than Wave 1. And there have been slowdowns that we need to respect, whether it's the example I gave for White Dog Wapsimung, or other communities that we had been hopeful in March would be lifted, but are going to take a little time. That may be June, and we need to respect that because of, notably in that case, an outbreak in the community.
Thanks, Olivia. Next question.
Hi, Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press. I'm wondering if you have any regrets that the government set the deadline for March 2021 to have all of these long-term advisories lifted, and if that's one of the reasons you're reluctant to put a more specific timeline on when the rest will be.
I don't think anyone cares about my regrets. Honestly, I'm not in a position to reflect on that. I know the job that I was told to get done, and I plan to get it done. This is something that is a basic matter of human decency, that in a country like Canada, people don't have access to clean water. It bugs me. But what's, again, whether it bugs me or not, probably most people don't care. What they want me here to do is to get it done. They want my deputy minister, who's leading a team that has been spending 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to keep people safe, focused on an equally important element in making sure people have clean water. So that's my responsibility. It's mine to own, and it's mine to get done with a team that has shown that it can change its ways through COVID. That has a large component of Indigenous voices within it that are showing us how we need to change things. And indeed, this is an old department. It may be new legally, but it has a long history to it, a long painful history to it. But It is committed to getting it done. I have spoken to chiefs. I've heard their feedback on some of the things they didn't think we did do as well. But that commitment, I believe, in the fall really is a signal to showing people that we're there for the long term. I don't want to undermine at the same time the two significant lifts that occurred today. And communities are very happy. I wish everyone could share in that, but they know that there's a lot more work to do, and they know that they have brother and sister communities across the country that aren't in their situation, and they're eager to keep the pressure on us to get it done. So, sort of my answer. Thanks.
In the fall economic statement, there was money, I think, for 5 years for new water treatment plants on reserves. And I'm wondering if that's any indication that you're concerned that there will be still this happening 5 years from now.
No, I mean, what the fall economic statement signals is continued investments on reserves. We've worked with communities for short-term, medium, and long-term investments. In some communities, while we could lift long-term water advisories, the Auditor General highlighted it. There were more longer-term investments to be made. So our signal to communities is that we're not, we're going to be with you past March 2021, whether it's your water infrastructure needs or others. This was one of the linked challenges in and around I believe Grassy Narrows, as we were announcing their water treatment, the Mercury Treatment Center. Some of those water and wastewater projects are reaching their end life, and that's the case in a number of communities. So it isn't a signal that this would push a community towards a certain date. We're ready to invest with communities in the long term for their priorities, because those have been signaled through our conversations that they need longer solutions as communities grow.
Thanks so much. We'll now go back to the phone. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Brett Forrester, APTN News. Line open.
Hello, Minister. You've mentioned several times the promise of a long-term commitment, and so far I think I've heard two promises, a commitment to continued O&M funding as well as a commitment to co-develop a new regulatory regime. Are those the two main things, and are there any other elements to that promise to be there long-term?
Yeah, Brett, as you know, the current regime or the law that's in place was and is has been largely criticized by First Nations, and so was not acceptable to them. So that commitment to work with them in partnership is ongoing. The AFN is working with us as well as other rights holders and regional organizations to fix that. It is something that we want to see done in the right way. But anything co-developed, if it's done in a respectful way, does in fact take time. That isn't the same thing as saying that there is no regulatory or compliance regime currently in place. No one would know about short-term water advisories or long-term water advisories if we didn't have an incredible group of water operators, many of whom are Indigenous, working around the country, testing, retesting, and collecting data to ensure that people are getting safe drinking water. So there isn't a void, but certainly there isn't the current status quo isn't ideal. But recall the massive criticism around the law that was brought in by former Prime Minister Harper, and the lack of as a unilateral colonial measure without the lack of investment and resources into it. So you mentioned two elements. One, the long-term element of O&M, which is our commitment to ensuring the asset integrity of water systems. You mentioned the second around a regulatory regime, but I would also add the third in terms of continued capital infrastructure into broadening our understanding of safe access to water that doesn't necessarily fall within the strict confines of lifting long-term water advisories. And your colleague in the previous question highlighted a number of those plans, and that may include ultimately new plants, but it can be things that vary in their level of investments and commitment.
Brett, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thanks. Switching gears a little bit for my follow-up, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the target audience for this new website, and the number that jumps out to me is the fact that Ontario has about 4 times as many impacted communities than the second most impacted province. So I'm wondering if you can explain why Ontario still has so many of these advisories, and in particular, why so many of these advisories are in the south or close to urban areas or municipalities and places like that.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. If you look at the broad spectrum of water advisories, you're absolutely right. The large majority of them reside in Ontario. I don't think, if I offered an explanation as to why that was for such a long time period, people would find it particularly compelling or credible. We've engaged with communities, I would say, and I would invite you to go through that renewed website as to what the particular status is in those communities with respect to the plan to lift those long-term water advisories. There are a number, and I would note a number of them that have had very, very long water advisories in place that are producing clean water. So I'm always hopeful. It is a matter of time. This is tested and clean water. That isn't the case in particular to one that captured everyone's attention and with good reason at the end of November and December in the Scandiga. The water now has been testing clean for some time. But that, by extension, does not mean that the community will necessarily lift the long-term water advisory. They've asked us for a number of other elements that I was glad to put into writing as to a pathway forward into lifting the water advisories. There is what I consider legitimate skepticism around water safety, given the history that if you've had 25 years, a quarter of a century on a long-term water advisory, you can't expect people to have that confidence overnight. And the chief has highlighted that, and we've acknowledged it, and something we will work with them long-term. And yes, when you talk about stuff in the south, there is one community that, or perhaps a couple that are stuck between 2 Great Lakes. So you ask yourself, why is that? But they're ready to lift theirs as well. So there is progress there. I would invite you to go through that site and look at the plans that are in place to lift them, because we're eager, and I'm eager to engage and continue to engage with leadership on the ground to renew our commitment to getting it done.
Thanks, Brett. And operator, last question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question is from Zach Becerra from Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Your line is open.
Hello, Minister, and a very early happy birthday. It happens that we share one, and I'm hoping that factoid will allow you to forgive me for changing course on questions here a little bit. You spoke earlier in the press conference about the threat of fraudulent vaccine deals, essentially. So I'll get right to it. Do you believe that James Smith Cree Nation and the FSIN asked Indigenous Services Canada for money to finance a vaccine deal that was not legitimate? And if not, what exactly happened there?
Look, Zach, these are difficult conversations we had, because when I reflect on the vaccine hesitancy that we've all talked about in Indigenous communities, my biggest worry, and I do worry about illegitimate offers, and we have indications from the companies that these offers are indeed not legitimate. That sets off a lot of alarm bells. I do worry about fraud. We should all worry about fraud. My greatest worry would be to see the chain of custody in these vaccines compromised. I know the logistics and the incredible operations that Canada has deployed to make sure that safe effective, and free vaccines get into this country in a safe way. If that supply chain is compromised, money isn't my worry. My worry is the health and safety of the people that would get that vaccine. So those are the considerations we take into this when we see these offers that may be very, very attractive and may indeed seem too good to be true. I would venture to think that if they were legitimate, the government of Canada would be all over them and procuring them and offering them for free. I don't preclude any particular person or nation from doing what it can to make sure its people are safe. But from the perspective I have, the duty that I have, the duty that this department has towards Indigenous peoples, the integrity and safety of the chain of custody of a vaccine that if it were to get into a community and not be what it is supposed to be, could be devastating.
I spoke to Chief Wally Burns last week, and he alluded to a entity in Ontario that he said helped facilitate that proposed deal. That entity has denied any involvement in anything to do with COVID-19 vaccine procurement. But I'm wondering if ISC has taken any kind of corrective action here. Have you been in correspondence with law enforcement, for example? Is anything happening in response to this incident?
Yes, we've been in contact with law enforcement, and I would make it there. I would take this opportunity to make it as clear to anyone that's listening that anyone purporting to be an agent of the Indigenous Services Canada, that is a private company and not someone that is a member of the public service, should be looked on with great skepticism and indeed great reticence.
Thank you, Zach. And that concludes today's press conference. Ceci me fait la conférence de presse. Merci.